Welcome to AlexGs Aquarium, everybody. Today I want to talk about feeding the fish in the 1600-gallon system. I have to say, feeding the fish has got to be one of the most enjoyable aspects of the aquarium hobby, whether you're into freshwater, saltwater, brackish water. Feeding the fish is always just a fun activity for the aquarium owner, their family, children, friends, anybody. It's one of the reasons that I got into the hobby was wanting to be able to feed the fish, because it's just a fun activity to see. My wife loves when the fish are getting fed. She loves to come downstairs, sit down in front of the tanks as I feed everybody. Not only is feeding the fish a fun activity, it's a very important part of the aquarium hobby and keeping your fish healthy. I want to talk a little bit about the different types of foods that I feed in the 1600-gallon system, because there can be a lot of choices out there, and it can be very overwhelming for anybody that's new in the hobby, or even an experienced aquarist that is getting into keeping new species of fish that require different kinds of food. Let's jump into the foods that I feed in the 1600-gallon system. I want to start off by talking a little bit about the feeding schedule that I have for the 1600-gallon system. I start off by feeding some form of dry food when I get home. Typically it's pellets, because one, it's an easy meal, two, it doesn't require me to take the screen tops off any of the tanks, and it's highly nutritious for the fish. Basically becomes an easy meal. I can come downstairs, give a small pinch of food, and get the tank fed. Now, I will say, with all the dry foods I have in front of me, I don't feed all these foods every single day. I do a variety of foods, which is something important to do when you get into feeding your fish. And it doesn't matter if they're freshwater, saltwater, brackish water, a variety is always something that's important. And there are some foods that come packed as a big variety of a meal, but I tend to try and get multiple foods just because it's just good for the fish. If they're enjoying the different types of foods, there's nothing wrong with giving them a variety of different kinds. Typically when I get home, I'm feeding one of these two pellets to the fish, either the Spectrum pellets or the PE pellets. And I have a couple different sizes of them based on the fish that I'm feeding. When it comes to the herbivores in the tanks, which they haven't been getting it lately because they have algae to eat in the tank, I will get out some dried nori sheet. Rod's Foods makes a nice little variety pack with a few different kinds of algae in it, which once the fish get through the algae problems in the tank or finish eating off what's there, I'll start including some of this into either their frozen food or just putting it on a clip for them. Finally, getting into specialized dry foods, I have these dehydrated krill sticks from my aquarium box that I bought for the puffer fish in the 720-gallon tank. Now, this is a more specialized food. I don't feed it every day, but every couple of days I'll get some of these krill sticks out and I'll put them into the 720-gallon tank. Some of the bigger wrasses have a lot of fun grabbing them as well, but the puffers enjoy them just as much. It's important to keep some specialized foods on hand if you have fish that have specialized feeding needs or something very particular in their diet. All around though, it gives me an immense variety of food to feed in the tank, so I'll rotate through this every day as my first feeding takes place. As you can see, I put the pellets in. I don't try to soak them up with water or anything. I simply just put them in right through the screen top. You can see the fish instantly start to jump on these pellets. All of the wrasses, some of the rhodogrammas, the rabbit fish in the 480-gallon tank, all the fish in the 480-gallon are getting a lot of interest in going after the pellets. You notice I don't put a lot in. It's just a small pinch of food. And not all the fish are always going to get fed by this method, but it does encourage them to come up and eat. They learn over time that there is a scarce amount, they need to grab some. But it's not the only feeding of the day, and that's not the only food that's going around in the tanks all the time. The 720-gallon tank is the same way. I throw a little bit of pellet food in there. Typically the wrasses and the damsels come up pretty quickly to get it. The foxface that's in there also has been showing more interest. And the puffer, well, sometimes they aren't that active in getting into the pelletized foods. The Dogface has shown a little bit of interest from time to time, and the porcupine, well, when I filmed this, the porcupine puffer was just sleeping. Frozen food is the main feeding that I do every evening for the tank, and I do again have a wide variety of foods. Now, I would say if you're just starting off with feeding your fish frozen foods for marine aquarium fish, there's a couple of different foods that I would be thinking about to get kind of a general feeding requirement. Rods has their original complete food, which I generally have either this or some of the LRS Fish Frenzy mixed into my cups for feeding the fish. Now, I will also mix in generally a PE mysis or Rod's Plankton. For my herbivores, I have an herbivore blend from Rod's Foods. I also have fish eggs from Rod's Foods, with the little fish really do enjoy. I feed on a pretty regular basis those foods. For my predatory fish, the puffers more or less, I do feed clams on a half shell, which I got a couple of these left. And I don't really feed them to my fish, but if I eventually get some triggers, I might do a little bit in the way of silver sides. Typically I feed these to my mantis shrimp though. The other major food that I do feed a lot is cocktail shrimp. I usually just get some easy peel deveined shrimp that are uncooked, and I feed this to my puffers. I feed it to some of the corals, and the other fish also will get some shrimp as well. Just pick that up at the grocery store. Now, as I get more fish and it becomes a little more feasible, I'm probably going to, in addition to these foods, also start buying more food from the grocery store and making up some of my own mixes. But I think it's important though to have a very large variety of food for your fish. It keeps them active, it keeps them happy and healthy. The krill is also another one that I feed on occasion, but it's not the staple diet for your fish. It's a good rotating food into the mix. All these foods though, I tend to rotate 2 or 3 varieties per day and put them into both tanks at the same time. Of course, for the puffers, they'll get larger meals every other day, and typically do a clam on the half shell, or I'll do a shrimp that's frozen. I want to have something that works their jaw to make sure that their teeth are being worn down, because it's a very important aspect of keeping puffers. The one thing to remember is have a nice variety of fish food. That can be pretty intimidating to open up the freezer at your local fish store, or even shopping online for it and seeing all these different varieties. The big thing is to get a couple of overall general foods that have a good blend of everything. Like I said, the Rod's Original, and also LRS has their Fish Frenzy. Both of these are pretty good staples, are overall good for your fish to have. It's a good base to start with in frozen food. Don't feel you have to buy a giant variety of foods all at once. I typically buy a few varieties at a time, and as they go down, I'll just replenish them and maybe buy another additional food. And of course, if you have animals that need specific foods like the puffer, I will use the shrimp, the clam on a half shell. I also have Rod's krill, which is another food that I tend to feed the larger fish and the puffers on occasion. The main thing I want to stress to everybody though is have a variety of stuff, but take your time to build that variety up. Don't feel you need it immediately. Now, if you have fish that require a specialty diet, such as the puffers, you have to have something that has some crunch or shell on it to make sure that they're wearing down their teeth. Otherwise, it can become a serious health problem for your puffers. That's why I typically will feed the cocktail shrimp to them by hand. I typically will feed cocktail shrimp to the puffers while it's still frozen, because it makes them have to work their jaws a lot harder. The same thing with the clam on the half shell. I keep the half shell on there. I want them to bite onto that shell, and trust me, puffers are very good at what they do. Swallowing pieces of shell and pieces of an exoskeleton of a shrimp are not a problem for their digestive system. In fact, it's even necessary to a certain point. But that's the foods I feed for the 1,600 gallon system. I want to go through a feeding session now of the frozen food and show everybody just how I feed the fish the frozen and the quantities. Before I get into feeding the fish their second round of food, there is one more food that I want to talk about today briefly. I'm going to do a follow-up video on this right now, but I wanted to talk about it. For the last few weeks, I have been culturing white worms. Now, white worms are typically looked upon as a freshwater food. They are similar to an earthworm. They're much smaller and they live in soil. They're pretty easy to maintain, and I have a small culture of them going here. It's the first time I've been trying them out, and what I've been doing is feeding them a couple different types of flake food based on the recommendation of the company that I purchased them from. Ultimately, I have to thank Paul B on the Reef to Reef forum for bringing up white worms. While I wanted to potentially get black worms, I did see he had written up some posts on white worms. And the whole idea behind culturing live foods and feeding it to your fish is that these foods allow live bacteria to be fed to your fish through these worms. You could purchase a culture for about $10. These worms are very easy to culture, and I'll get into more of how I'm culturing them soon. I want to do a little bit more in the way of experimentation with them, but I do have some of these worms separated from their soil right now, and I'm going to feed those to the fish tonight as well as just the frozen food. And this is another food that I have been starting to experiment with a bit. I'm going to have more on it once I keep this culture for a few more weeks and I get a little bit more in tune with keeping it. But stay tuned. I'm going to get the frozen food ready along with some white worms I'm separating right now into water, and we'll get the fish fed. We're now ready to feed the fish this evening. I want to start off by talking about the frozen fish foods that I prepared for tonight. In each one of these cups, I have a little bit of PE Mysis, Rod's Original, and LRS Fish Frenzy. What I'm going to do for these is simply take the white worms that I have separated from their culture, which the water might look a little bit dirty, but really all that's in here is just spirulina flake that they were feeding on to kind of get them bunched up into one group. I'm also going to feed clam on a half shell to the puffer fish. All I'm going to do to get the worms in here is simply just take this water. It's just RO water I took, and I kind of stir everybody up here, pour it in a bit, try to get about half of it in one, and then the other half in the other one. Now, while this looks pretty cloudy, as I said, it's just reverse osmosis water and the spirulina flake that was mixed in with the worms as I was separating them. So there's not any other kind of pollutants or problems in this water. And we're just going to let everything kind of thaw out before we feed this to the fish. I'm going to put a little bit of tank water in with the half shell clams to get them thawing out. Then we'll move on to feeding the fish their primary food, and then we'll move to specialized feeding of the puffers. hope everybody enjoyed today's video on feeding the fish in the 1600 gallon system. I want to leave everybody with a closing shot and a preview of some footage that will be coming shortly, because I have a new piece of equipment to help film in the 1600 gallon system. If you have any comments or questions on today's video with feeding the fish, any of the foods that I was using, or questions about foods in general, please leave them down below. If you like today's video, please go ahead, hit that like button. And if you'd like to see more on the 1600 gallon system, please go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I will see you on the next video.